And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? We indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Today is Christ the King Sunday. It's also known as the Reign of Christ. It's an interesting church festival. It's the last Sunday in the church year. Yes, you can celebrate New Year's next week. This is the time when we close out the season of Pentecost. And as fitting, this season of Pentecost, which began all the way back earlier this year, this season of Pentecost is the time of the year where we celebrate the work of the church in proclaiming the gospel. So it is good that we close it out by declaring whom we serve, the purpose that we are serving. And it is good to be here. The church's message is countercultural. The church's message is at odds with the stories that the world seems to say. The church's message is the most unique message that has ever been. And we do forget that, don't we? We say that this is a unique message. And yet we look to the metrics, we look to the ways of the world to judge how well we are doing. Remember that at the very beginning of the church, it was nothing more than God hanging alone on a tree, with desperate people around him losing hope. That is what we celebrate. This odd paradox. And you know what? It can feel often like this is a story about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Have you ever felt that? That you were at the wrong place at the wrong time? We all have felt that. And it could be a small thing like showing up at the wrong entrance. Or it could be a big thing about feeling like you've pursued a life's goal only to watch it peter out. In my own life, I can remember deciding to go to a particular seminary. And while I was at that seminary, I felt like maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Years later, as I reflect upon that, I remember things. There were great thinkers I was introduced to. great friendships and relationships I have. Even my marriage has its origins at being at the wrong place, at the wrong time. You see, it's only in hindsight that we see the important relationships that come about when we least expect them to do so. There is a way that we can miss out, though. And that's if we are so concerned with our own priorities that we can find ourselves not just overlooking wonderful opportunities that might arise from being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but indeed railing against them. The passage here in Luke's Gospel lays out 3 different types of people who were not content to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. They were not happy with where they were. These people are represented here in the form of the Romans, who are concerned with their power, the religious leaders who are concerned with performance, and the other criminal who is concerned with place. Power, performance, and place can be wonderfully intoxicating drugs, can't they? They can lead us to think that the gospel is not enough. They can lead us to overlook Christ on the cross. And they can make us feel insecure. They can make us feel that everything is wrong. And we can be stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time and then double down on our own emotions, double down on our own way of looking at the world instead of looking to Christ. But know this, all will be left behind in the wake of Christ's mission and in the wake of Christ's message. The message to his neighbor, to God, and to ultimately the world. So let's focus first on these distractions. We have, as I have said, come to the end of the year. Before we make our ascent through Advent, that dark time of waiting for Christ, and yet that anticipation of Christmas, we must pass through this day, Christ the King Sunday. What an odd holiday where we celebrate the enthronement of Christ. In the Gospel of John, we hear that Christ must be high and lifted up. But the implication is that his throne will be the cross. It is through this that he is justified to rule. When Satan comes to him to tempt him, to try and find other avenues for power, to find other avenues for influence, Christ looks to the cross, and so should we. Everything about this day, though, seems to be at the wrong place, at the wrong time. If this really is how you want to accomplish your mission, doesn't it seem to just be a dead end? Along with the religious leaders, we may ask, Christ wants power, so shouldn't he be in the halls of power? If Christ is indeed the king, why is he being executed as a criminal? And indeed, even in our own days, if the shopkeepers and the corporations and the cable channels are all entering into the Christmas spirit, as they have for so many months now, why doesn't the church do the same? It is, after all, our holiday. And no doubt this is just how the religious leaders felt. The leaders, not just of religion, but of politics, and the influencers of Jesus' day. But beneath that veneer of power, there was a fear that everything could go horribly wrong. Rome had accomplished everything in the Western world. that it could ever dare imagine. Indeed, many empires had risen and fallen by the time Rome had ascended. Its power stretched from Germany to the Sahara, from Spain to Israel. If you were betting on what would last forever, you would not bet on a man crucified on the outskirts and periphery of that empire. But those in power knew all too well that to have a grip on power is to have a fragile grip on power. Rome lived in constant fear that some mighty king, through military force, would overthrow everything. They were desperate to put down rebellions before they started, because the empire they built was made of glass. And the slightest nick would make it all come crashing down. No doubt when they executed Jesus, they didn't think this would be the person who would bring about their own destruction. They had lived through great conquerors. They had risen to face great emperors. Surely this powerless man would not be the one to overthrow them all. And so they mocked him when they thought they'd won. So too with the religious leaders, who believed their personal piety would wipe away all their errors. Don't we all do this? Christ got me in before God, but it's up to me to justify myself. What a painful path that is. It starts off feeling so good. Finally we have meaning. Finally we have purpose. Finally we are good enough. But you can never overcome those doubts. There's always someone just a little better than you. Someone who went that little extra mile somewhere else. So you worry. These religious leaders believed that sin could be controlled or bargained at, or at least excused. And this is the most damaging part. When we cannot bargain our way into God's good grace, when we cannot control sin, we begin looking at others and saying, at least I'm not as bad as that person. They had given up looking for the Messiah outside of themselves, outside of their own righteousness and moralistic window dressing. And certainly they didn't believe he was appearing right before their own eyes. And so they too mocked him when they thought they were holier. The final person to mock Jesus was that of an outlaw. He'd lived his life measured against his own sense of power. Maybe he'd been involved in one of the many failed coups against the Romans. Or maybe he was just a bandit who had happened to bite off more than he could chew. In any case, he must have been safe enough in his own identity. No matter what lies he told himself to bring him to this point, to think at least he was not as bad as this nut job standing next to him, who was saying he was the Son of God, and the King of the Jews, and the Messiah. This man's a lot like us, isn't he? When we are at our lowest point, it is comforting to still look down and say, at least I'm not like this poor slob. At least I'm not delusional enough. And he mocked him because he thought he was better than him. Indeed, he mocked him because he thought he knew the world a little bit better. The problem with all of these sinners was that they were so concerned with what they wanted that they didn't realize that it wasn't what they needed. The Romans, the religious leaders, The criminal next to Jesus had to put on a mask and pretend that things really weren't out of their control, and that at the very least, that they were better than Jesus. Friends, that is the definition of sin. When you believe that your righteousness exceeds that of Christ's grace. The other criminal realized that his life had carried him to this point, though, which from the world's perspective was the very epitome of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. God's kingdom works a little differently, doesn't it? In God's time, this person's timing couldn't have been better. He'd most likely been looking to be part of something greater than himself. Something important, something holy, something that would show to the world and to his own fragile ego that he mattered. And just look where it got him. Look where it gets us. In the world's standard, it brought him to the lowest point, but just look where it indeed brought him. It brought him next to the one who could deliver all of those hopes and dreams that he had had. We still face these false temptations of the Roman leaders, religious leaders, the thief on the cross. And it's easy for those inside and outside the church to declare Jesus isn't enough. There's something more. But when we offer the assurance that God's kingdom is here, we proclaim that same message which Christ did. When plans fall through, or our hopes in ourselves leave us so empty that we look down on Christ crucified, we are missing out on the message that is for all of us. There is no wrong place or wrong time for those who have been crucified with Christ. So as we end this church year and begin our anticipation of Christ's arrival, let us proclaim his presence in a world that desperately needs to hear good news. Let us proclaim one King who is enthroned upon the cross, to have dominion not just of the world, but of all of our lives. Amen.
All be made.